The world looked impossibly small from that height, a sea of treetops shimmering beneath the morning haze. The wind screamed against a helicopter's frame as two uniformed officers gripped the wrists of a struggling black woman, her hands cuffed tight behind her back. Her voice was lost in the roar of the rotor blades, but her eyes burned with a strange, steady calm. They thought it was fear. It wasn't. The cop at her left shouted something, unheard, and gave a signal. The other nodded. Then, with a violent push, they hurled her into the open sky. For a brief second, time froze. Her body spun downward, hair whipping, cuffs glinting against the sunlight. From a helicopter window, one officer smirked, the other laughed nervously, until the altimeter beeped and something impossible happened. Instead of falling helplessly, her descent slowed. The air seemed to fold around her, as if unseen hands guided her through the wind. The pilot swore. The cop stared, speechless. Somewhere below, the woman vanished into forest canopy, swallowed by the earth itself. When search teams arrived hours later, all they found were the broken remains of the cuffs and a badge. Not a police badge, a military one. It read, U.S. Army Tactical Operations Division. That night, the two officers were pulled from active duty. Within days, one went missing. The other started talking in his sleep, repeating the same phrase over and over. She didn't fall, she flew. But the truth, the real truth, began long before that flight. In a quiet town, on an ordinary morning, when an extraordinary woman found herself caught in a system that had no idea who it was trying to break. Before the world saw her as the woman who fell from the sky, Major Aaliyah Grant was just another face in the crowd. To her neighbors in the small Georgia town of Magnolia Creek, she was quiet, polite, and private, the kind of person who didn't speak much but seemed to see everything. Few knew that behind her gentle demeanor was a woman with 2 decades of decorated military service. Aaliyah had served in multiple combat zones, leading search and rescue operations that saved countless lives. She jumped out of aircraft more times than most pilots had landed one. She was a tactical survival specialist, a soldier who trained others how to stay alive in the harshest conditions. But after her last deployment, she'd chosen peace over medals. She wanted to start fresh, to build a life that didn't depend on violence or survival instincts. She bought a modest home near the edge of town, took a job as a youth counselor for at-risk teens, and spent weekends teaching local kids how to swim, hike, and defend themselves. She believed that if young people learned resilience early, they'd never be broken later. But in Magnolia Creek, peace wasn't evenly distributed. The local police department had a long, ugly history. Traffic stops that turned into beatings, arrests for resisting that never made sense, and a chief who thought body cameras were optional. For most of the town's black residents, living there meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. Aaliyah didn't do either. One evening, while driving home from the community center, she witnessed 2 officers harassing a black teenager near a convenience store. She stopped her car, stepped out, and demanded they stop. The officers ignored her until she flashed her government ID. That single act, a black woman telling 2 white officers to back off, would change everything. They reported her for interfering with an active investigation. She filed a formal complaint against them for racial misconduct. The police chief brushed it off as a misunderstanding, but the complaint reached a state-level investigator, and suddenly, Magnolia Creek PD found themselves under scrutiny. The officers never forgot her face. Weeks later, when her tires were mysteriously slashed, when her mail started arriving opened, and when a police cruiser coincidentally followed her everywhere she went, she knew it wasn't random. What she didn't know, yet, was that the same 2 officers were about to make a move so cruel, so reckless, it would rewrite their fates forever. It began on a humid Friday morning. Aaliyah woke early to prepare for a training session at a nearby military base, a temporary contract gig teaching helicopter extraction safety. She packed her duffel, loaded it into her Jeep, and left home before sunrise. The air was heavy with fog, the kind that made the world feel muted. Halfway down Route 78, flashing lights appeared in her rear-view mirror. She pulled over instinctively, heart steady. She'd done nothing wrong. 2 familiar faces emerged from the patrol car. The same officers from before. They claimed her vehicle matched the description of a suspected drug runner. She laughed at the absurdity of it, but their tone turned cold. Within minutes, one had his hand on his gun, the other was cuffing her. Aaliyah demanded to see a warrant. They ignored her. They searched her car, finding nothing but uniforms, equipment, and training manuals. When they opened a sealed case marked military property, they called for backup, claiming she was transporting illegal weaponry. She tried to explain. They didn't care. The radio crackled. A code word passed. They weren't bringing her in. They were taking her somewhere else. Hours later, Aaliyah's Jeep was found abandoned near an airfield 40 miles away. No body cam footage, no arrest record, no radio logs. She had simply disappeared. By afternoon, rumors spread a domestic terrorist had been intercepted during a transport mission. The story was false, but it gave the officers cover. Inside the helicopter, Aaliyah realized what was happening. The cuffs dug into her wrists, the rotor blades screamed above, and below her stretched endless wilderness. She'd been trained for war zones, but she hadn't expected to face execution at home. The officers taunted her, shouting things she couldn't hear over the wind. But she caught one phrase, "You people never learn." When the door slid open, she looked them in the eyes, not pleading, not afraid, and whispered something they couldn't make out. Then they pushed. She fell. But gravity wasn't her enemy. Training took over. Her body twisted midair, aligning with the downdraft. Her boots hit the wind resistance just right. She slowed. Not like flying, not like falling, but like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She aimed for the treetops, angling her body, protecting her neck. The impact was brutal, but she survived. They thought she was dead. She wasn't. And when the forest grew silent, she crawled out from the underbrush, bloody but breathing, and she was done running. Night fell. The officers celebrated quietly, drinking whiskey at a remote hangar. They laughed about solving her problem, bragged about teaching her a lesson, but neither noticed a blinking light on their dash cam, recording every word. By midnight, a storm rolled in. The air crackled with thunder. One officer went to check the perimeter. The other stayed behind, uneasy. He kept hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, footsteps where there shouldn't be any. Then silence. When he stepped outside, flashlight trembling, he saw something that made his blood freeze. A muddy handprint on the helicopter's landing skid. Fresh. He called his partner's name. No answer. The storm drowned everything. Lightning flashed, and for a second he saw her, standing in the rain, bruised, soaked, still wearing the same cuffs, but alive. He fired. Missed. She moved like a ghost, closing the distance faster than he could reload. His weapon flew from his hand. He stumbled backward, falling into the mud. She stood over him, breath steady, eyes cold. No words. Just justice. By dawn, state troopers arrived at the hangar, responding to an anonymous tip. They found both officers unconscious, restrained with the same cuffs they'd used on her. The helicopter was still running, dash cam footage intact, capturing everything, their bragging, their confession, their crimes. And inside the cockpit, taped to control panel, was her military ID. The message was clear. She had survived. The footage spread like wildfire. News anchors called it the Magnolia Creek incident. The world called it something else, the woman who fell from the sky. An internal investigation exposed years of abuse, falsified reports, and systemic racism within the department. The two officers faced federal charges. The police chief resigned. Aaliyah refused interviews. She told reporters she didn't want fame. She wanted reform. She used the settlement money to fund a nonprofit for women of color in law enforcement and military service, providing them legal and psychological support. For the first time, her story wasn't just hers. It became a mirror, a reflection of how far someone would go to silence a black woman, and how far she'd go to stand tall. In Magnolia Creek, the department finally installed mandatory body cams. The town painted a mural of Aaliyah on the community center wall. Wings spread behind her, rising above the clouds. The inscription read, She didn't fall. She rose. And somewhere in the same forest where she landed that day, her broken cuffs still hang from a branch, rusted, silent, and free. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the sky. Sometimes it comes from the ground, from the woman they thought would never get back up,